Right, well, there's only two of us on the program. In welcome, welcome to Monash Matters, stories for people around the COVID experience. And I look forward to having you on I'm looking forward to our conversation today on this program, Shin.
Thank you, Russell, for having me. It's a great pleasure to speak to you.
Shin, what's your full name so I get the pronunciation right?
My full name is Zin Yin Ui. Most people in Australia, they just call me Zin,
Yeah, yeah,
and that's fine.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks. Thank you. Now, you've got a story to tell, not just about the court cases and litigation, two of them, but your background and how you ended up in the position you're in and the challenges that you took on. So, where would you like to start? Because I'm in your hands.
Russell, I would really like to talk through my journey, and I work for the New South Wales government, and I still work for them. You would likely to find my experience being quite representative of the many thousands of workers, both from the public and private sector, that you have come through who had a concern about being asked or mandated to take the COVID-19 vaccination shots to maintain their employment.
Yeah.
So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, while I did go through the court, and I did that twice, in fact. First, to challenge the mandatory vaccination mandate at that time. And the second was to challenge the disciplinary proceedings that I was made to sit through as a result of being hesitant to take the vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines. And I think while the journey of going through the court is perhaps a little unusual for most people, but the experience that I went through, being someone who who works for an employer who were mandated to take the COVID-19 vaccination to maintain employment, you would very likely find that representative of many people that you come across. And if you would allow me, I can give you a brief chronology of the event,
Yeah.
if that's okay. So, so the mandatory vaccination requirement, uh, it happened in December 2021. And if you could, because I understand that you may not be as familiar because you live in Victoria, but in New South Wales, we were in the middle of the longest lockdown during that time. I think that was 107 days for the vaccinated population and longer for the unvaccinated people like me, myself. So at that time, I have gone through over 100 days of being isolated at home and being told that there is a vaccination direction coming from my employer that if I want to stay in my job, I would need to receive 2 doses of the COVID vaccines to keep my job. So that's really the core event that we are talking about. So I was mandated to get the vaccines, and I was faced with the choice of complying or non-complying. The consequences of non-complying would include losing my job, as was made quite clear at that time. So, so well, I guess there are immediate things that happen, including the emotional trauma that I went through at that time, knowing that, oh gosh, this is actually coming. And part of it actually was because I had a bit of a hesitancy to begin with, because I having gone through the pandemic and studying the virus for my own good for a while. And I knew at the time that the vaccines were quite new, and they were not quite the traditional type of vaccines that we were normally receiving from just the general other illnesses. So this is quite novel to begin with, and I haven't quite got my head around what it is and what it does, and suddenly my employer is mandating it. And for the background of just for your purpose of your listeners, I work in predominantly a office-based role. So I am a data analyst or data scientist. I do a lot of work from the desk or from the back office. So I was not one of the frontline workers. But it sort of comes across as being strange that an office-based worker is mandated the vaccines. So what happened in the subsequent few months is I went through a period of emotional trauma, and then faced with the choice of either doing something or just walking away from my job or being fired, essentially. So at that time, I thought I really had nothing to lose, and why don't I get and ask around whether someone is in the same position as me. I happen to be fortunate to find a few colleagues in the same position, and we got together, do some crowdfunding, and we decided to do a legal challenge to the vaccination mandate. Took us a few weeks, but what happened in that first court case is we never really stepped through the door of the court. It was at the pre-litigation conversations with my employer that a decision was then made to have a pause on the mandate and not try to do this. So I'm talking about the period between December to April. So that April time point was when my first court experience, if you like, sort of ended because my employer decided to take a pause on their actions. And then many months later, I started the process of a second court challenge. And this time around, what I challenged was the manner that I was treated during that period. So I want to take the time back to when I was imposed a mandatory vaccination requirement. That was December. 3 months later, in March, I was handed a official final warning letter from my employer saying, you haven't been vaccinated. You cannot work from this point. We are going to begin. If you don't get vaccinated, we are going to undertake a disciplinary proceeding under Section 69 of the Government Sector Employment Act, which is the legislation that governs the employment of public servants in New South Wales. So it's quite serious, Russell. So Section 69 is normally reserved for the worst behavior in public servants. So things like corruption would fall under that category, taking money from illegally, bullying, harassment, criminal behavior, etc., etc. So honestly, I never in my wildest dream thought I would be, placed on that procedure.
That's a huge threat to you, isn't it?
It is a huge threat, and it comes with immense emotional stress and trauma. And I had various conversations with my family, in fact, thinking, so we were talking about, is it worth fighting, or is this something that you want on your reputation? Because what happens was, if I was found to have a misconduct under Section 69, that would be a tarnish on my reputation. They
call it gross misconduct too, don't they?
Correct. Yeah, something like serious misconduct, gross misconduct, something that is non-trivial. So it wasn't something like you are not doing your job on a Monday, right? So it's something that you have done to cause serious damage. And I had a problem with that. Why would my vaccination status be, even fit the definition of that proceeding? But my employer seems to take that approach and place me under that proceeding. So I did receive a formal allegations of misconduct on the 30th of March. So, and Russell, what was really interesting is during the period when I was mandated to get the vaccines and receiving an actual misconduct notice, I had visited my GPs a few times, asking questions about the vaccines. My GP advised me that she was not able to answer those questions, and I'm better off directing my questions to a more reliable source. And she pointed me to two sources. Number one is the Sydney Olympics Park Vaccination Center. So apparently that is the biggest vaccination hub in the state. So they have all the experts who can answer questions, right? Second, my GP also advised that I write to the vaccine manufacturers to get an official response to my queries. So I had about 7 questions. Things like I want to know whether the vaccine stays in my arm, so whether it circulates around my body, whether it affects my fertility or menstruation cycle, things like that really is personal to myself. So my GP couldn't answer me and asked me to write to the vaccination hub and also to the vaccine manufacturer. So what was actually quite interesting is when I was mandated to get the vaccines, my employer is fully aware of all this because I put in an exemption application. And I use that as a basis for asking for more time for me to consider the vaccines. I was still undergoing this process of asking for information, being, part of the informed consent process. My employer was fully aware of it. And in fact, in February, just sort of a month before giving me the misconduct notice, my employer approved my application for an exemption for more time to consider the vaccines, depending on what information I received. However, what happened a month after was, as I was still still waiting to receive the information, they started the misconduct process. And actually, the misconduct notice was delivered to me a day after I received something from the Therapeutic Goods Administrator, TGA. I got an email back from TGA after my inquiry. The TGA said that the Novavax vaccines, which is the vaccine that I was looking for information, affects my fertility, or it kind of implies that there's no safety studies that's being undertaken to prove that it's safe for me in that regards. I told my employer that. I basically showed them the information, but they still proceed to hand a misconduct notice to me, indicating that this might not be something that they consider as credible or important enough to affect their decision to hand down the vaccination direction. And that is all happening, after being locked down at home, for more than 100 days and having to go back to work, but receiving this and indicating that it might be the end of my career. So my court challenge that I commenced later on was about this disciplinary proceeding that I was made to sit through. So in my mind, I thought, again, vaccination has never been part of the requirement of my job. I have been in my job for 7 years. Why now? And why this provision? So it's quite serious. And it caused me to lose income. Russell, I lost so during the period that I was made to sit through Section 69 proceeding, I was completely without income. My employer has, at the time, decided that leave without pay would fit that definition of what I'm doing. So they placed me on it without my consent, causing me to essentially be without an income for a period of time while that proceeding goes on. So to me, that's punitive, and it's quite serious because I wouldn't be able to feed my family, etc., buy groceries, pay my mortgage. It's going to destroy my life.
It's a double threat.
It's a double threat. So, but interestingly, in my second court case, which you can find on my page, if you just Google my name, and you should be able to find my Twitter page, I have shared a copy of the court decision on that case, which is between myself and the state government. I won that. And the court conclusion...
That one.
Yes, that's true. That's the right one, Russell. So the court has come to 2 main conclusions. The first is the vaccination direction that is being imposed on me was, while it may be lawful, it's not reasonable in my circumstances. And the reason being, I was investigating Novavax vaccine at the time that, the direction was being implemented. I was still in the process of seeking medical information. I had documentary evidence to show that I was actively doing that. And the fact that there's suitable alternatives that can be, accommodated to ensure that I can keep performing my work. But my employer, for some reason, chose not to consider those alternatives, but instead put me on a disciplinary proceeding. And the court has deemed that to be unreasonable in the circumstances. So I thank them for that, that ruling, because that's actually quite consistent with the Australian Immunisation Handbook, where it says that all of us have the right to informed consent when we consider whether to take a medical procedure, whether it's vaccines or medications of any sort. So, and that being one of the main reason why I won my case. The second reason that the court stated as to why that I won was the technical definition of leave without pay. And this is the disciplinary proceeding part of my case. Sorry, just turn that off. So I was placed on leave without pay while I was made to sit through the Section 69 proceeding. And there was no legal basis for them to do that, which, deprived me of my income while I was still facing a work situation of having to prove whether I have a misconduct or not. So I won on the basis of these two reasons. The first being I was still investigating and trying to get information to decide whether I should get vaccinated or not. The second is they have no right to do that while they put me through the disciplinary proceeding. Yeah.
Chin, did they back pay you?
They back paid me recently after I won.
With interest?
After I won the second case, they paid me back my salary. That was
with interest?
With interest. And interesting that you asked that, Russell. So I did get the court to award me a damage payment. And as well, I reflect on my journey, and particularly on this being, the core idea of. So the core idea is we haven't got any legislation or statute that says that the employer can't do this, but the default justice is purportedly being delivered by the court system, which is the judiciary process, precedent and case law. But in my case, I'm going to have to pay tax on that court damage, because court order damage, because the the Income Tax Assessment Act in our country, there's nowhere that recognizes the compensation nature of this payment. I actually went to ATO, the Australian Taxation Office, and asked them to do a private tax ruling on the nature of this payment. And I proposed that this is a compensation. This is a compensation to my 1 year of, emotional distress or trauma, whatever you call that, plus my personal effort of trying to seek justice. And I really had no other avenues to do it other than to do it myself, Russell, because the unions are reluctant to get into this space. And also the lawyers, if you actually get lawyers to represent you in the court, you will very quickly find that to be unaffordable for most people.
Yeah.
So my only option is to do it myself and have a stab and see whether it works out. And in my case, by the grace of God, I won. But at the same time, I thought, wow, if this is the core idea of our thinking of how justice can be delivered, not many people can afford to do this, Russell. It's quite time consuming and it's quite stressful and expensive if you get lawyers to represent you. So I did, long story short, I did get the damage being awarded to me, but I still have to pay tax because there's nothing at the present stage that recognizes that as a compensation, similar to a personal injury, relief or damage. It's just like a recovering unpaid wages. And for most of the people who are affected by the vaccination mandate, the loss of salary is what they suffered.
Yeah.
So whether you are frontline or back office, what you really suffered is a loss of income, I guess, plus the trauma, but nothing at this point is going to recognize that, Russell.
So you're saying to me that a compensation payment is not taxable?
Is taxable.
Is taxable.
It is taxable, which means after 1 year of pursuing this, court case myself, I managed to get a win. I managed to recover my unpaid wages plus interest. I still have to pay tax on the full amount of this court order that I received from my employer. So in a way, it's not, the current process don't recognize the compensatory nature of it, similar to how, personal injury workers' compensation works.
Well,
and the reason is we don't have anything that states that it is the case.
Either the insurer or the employer or the insurer of the employer should pay not only the compensation, but the tax you will have to pay on it too, or the federal government foregoes tax on compensation payments because they're not part of your wage.
They're not. No, they are not my wage, as I try to make the case.
To address trauma.
Yeah. That would be quite accurate to describe what I would view personally. That's how I see the payment as. It's a compensation for the trauma that I went through. I did not work at that time because I was disallowed to work due to the vaccine mandate.
Yeah.
I went through a long litigation to try to seek justice, and I did get justice in my case. I recognize that a lot of people don't have that privilege because they either they are not comfortable doing it themselves, or they can't afford the time costs of having to go through this, or the cost of hiring lawyers.
Yeah.
But even with my experience, which is in a way unusual because I go through a 1-year litigation against government lawyers, by the way, Crown solicitors to be precise, and they did outsource it to a law firm which is quite huge, McCabe's Legal. So I went to the court with all these experienced lawyers having to prove that I'm right, that I deserve compensation. I did win, but I guess the fact that I have to pay tax on it sort of reduced that compensation quite significantly.
Absolutely, it would.
Yeah.
Xin, I'd love to have from you, I'm asking you to do a little bit more work, send me a letter as to why that compensation payment for duress and real pain inflicted upon you through this time, and the double threat, not only the double threat of losing your job, but the threat of being thrown out with a dishonourable discharge virtually, which ends your career in the, both of these things are extremely traumatic, and taxation should not be paid on such an amount. And I will take that to the Deputy Treasurer and to the ATO as a Member of Parliament and ask that this to be rectified.
I will send that to you, Russell.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I have the private tax ruling from the ATO as well. So everything is in writing. And their current thinking is that there's no precedent. I suppose I'm paraphrasing, but what they are saying is there's nothing in the legislation that recognizes this type of compensation. As you would think, that's quite, in a way, this is unprecedented, Russell. We never had a situation in this country where you would be subject to a treatment like this at the workplace. So it's very novel, ironically, being, just like the virus itself, the treatment that is being imposed upon unvaccinated people it's quite extraordinary, and there was no precedent from history that we can look at and say, what's the right treatment? How would you deal with this type of situation? Because it's a new situation that we never had before, Russell.
Correct. And it is unprecedented.
Yeah.
It certainly was unexpected.
Yes, it's unexpected.
It's unusual, and it's unjust.
Very.
So I think we've got some very good reasons to, and you have been unique in this whole process. You're amazing.
Thank you. I think that is, I appreciate you saying it. And I can share that at the time, I was, like I told you, I fought the first one and we got a reprieve. And in my mind, I'm thinking, should I actually try to pursue a full justice, Russell, or am I happy with this outcome? So I had the choice that I was facing is either, accept that I had my job back. Obviously, there's no apology or any sort of things like that, and I didn't expect that. But do I go back and pursue this treatment that was so unjust, that was levied on me? Or do I just let it go and, pretend that never didn't happen? So I was asking myself that question for months before I decided to start the legal action. And the reason why I decided to go ahead was, I thought in 10 years' time, if I were to reflect upon this period of time, what had happened, would I be happy with myself of not trying to pursue the full justice when I could have tried to do it? And I did some research at that time, and I kind of knew in theory how I could do it. There's a legal aid website that the government provides that provides some basic information for people who want to self-represent themselves. And if I were to do it, the worst outcome is I lose, right? If I lose, then I might just, lose and just maybe incur a few financial loss, not too huge that I cannot afford. Do I try and see if I win, or do I just let it go and just pretend that never happened? So my heart is telling me that I should try. Because if I don't, if everyone in my position, don't try to pursue it, then we will never get true justice. You need someone to be willing to give it a go and somehow place themselves in a bit of a period of discomfort and stress, and see whether the court, is willing to do the right thing. And in my case, fortunately, the judiciary officer seems quite rational. She can see that I was being mistreated, that this was wrong, and especially because I was actively trying to investigate the vaccines at that time. It wasn't like I, flat out refused to even think about that idea. I did try to get information and try to make a decision. And all this happened while I was doing that. And that's not right. That's inconsistent with everything that the Australian Immunisation Handbook says.
Well, it's not only the Australian Immunisation Handbook, it's actually we as a nation would have an expectation of government. I'm not blaming your employer, because your employer was the same as every other employer across Australia.
Correct.
And the directions that they were given and had to believe that they had to accord to. But just the same, your bravery will be a shining light for thousands of others who will be listening to this presentation today.
Thank you, Russell, for saying that. I am quite grateful that I have the outcome that I had. And to your point about employers doing the same thing, I actually would like to just elaborate a little bit about my personal observation of how that happened. So in economics, so I went to school and university studying a major which relates to economics and financial things like that. So there is a theory that I could still remember being taught to me at that time, called herding behavior. So herding being it's like a sheep herd. So humans, interestingly, we behave in a way that we would like to imitate each other. So we follow the crowd, so to speak. And at that time, based on my current observation, the employers are displaying this behavior of a herding behavior. They look around themselves and go, okay, private sector and public sectors, what's going on? People were mandating these vaccines on the workers. So if my colleagues in the public sectors are doing that, then so should I. And that's generally how that happens. At least the part that I can observe. Central to that behavior was a public health advice that New South Wales Health produced to the public sector agencies. And according to, my secretary, in the communications that he sent to me, the thinking at that time was vaccination is the highest order control against COVID-19. That was the advice that was given to them. And unsurprisingly, you see people start mandating vaccines on their workers. It turns out, of course, hindsight is always 2020. We now know that it's not. The vaccines don't stop transmissions, don't really stop people from dying from COVID. But at the same time, Russell, it's more fundamental than that, isn't it? So it's not a principle that only apply to when the vaccine don't work. It should apply uniformly to any medical product or any medical procedure, which is not originally part of your employment contract. The employer just shouldn't have the right to dictate how you decide to on your body, Correct. On your health. Even if the vaccines, so my proposition is, even if the vaccines are better, let's say better by 50%, it's still wrong to do it on the workers, because especially when there are alternatives way to do it, there are ways that you can do other than that to control the risks, such as, if you require people to test more regularly for COVID, for example, before coming into the office. That sounds like a reasonable measure to try to control the risks. If that is available, then why should you insist on the measure about vaccination? Are we saying that the employer is going to control how you look after your health? For example, should they be mandating that no one should ever smoke in their life? Oh no, just if you apply that to the general principles, you will very quickly see that this is not the way we should operate a workplace. But unfortunately, back then, everyone or most employers who did that to their workers can't see it, Russell.
Well, they were going to be fined, and many of them were fined thousands and thousands, and up to $35,000, $40,000, $50,000. One was threatened with $150,000 in fines if they didn't conform. It was incredible. Now, I think every one of those fines that were collected by state governments should be repaid with interest.
Yeah, I would agree with you. In hindsight, we can see that it was very much an overreaction.
When governments overreact, and they're seen to overreact, they need to make recompense.
I won't hold my breath on when that can happen, but I certainly hope that happens, Russell, for the sake of many thousands who are affected.
Absolutely. Yeah. They broke a lot of businesses that way. Yeah. It's been absolutely marvellous to speak with you today. Thanks for coming on. I thank Dr. Julie Slatton for drawing you to our attention. And if you've got more to say into the future, I'd love you to come back and talk to me again.
Thanks, Russell, for having me today.
Thanks very much.
I appreciate it.
All the best to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.